realm of the Drumheads podcast, where beats meet banter. Whether you're a drummer or just love a good music story, Drumheads is your backstage pass to the world of drumming and all things in between. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to subscribe. And now here's the show.
That we've already started, so we can go ahead and get started if you don't mind. Yeah. So
I'm good.
How are
you? I'm just finished the day's teaching. I'm currently doing quite a lot of teaching, so it's still quite a nice evening here. So that's good.
How was your holiday?
Yeah, I was only away for a few days, so it wasn't really a holiday. Well, it was a very short holiday.
I mean,
Definitely,
one is better than none,
sure,
right?
For sure.
So, since we became friends on Facebook, I've noticed that you just said you finished teaching. Is that a passion of yours in addition to playing?
I mean, I've been teaching alongside playing now for, the teaching side I've been doing for coming on 35 years, So it's not a new thing. It's something that I've always done. I've always kind of run them concurrently, the playing and the teaching. Even when at points where maybe I've been, where I've had a lot more playing going on and I've thought about giving it up or stopping it, I've always had people advising me to keep it going because of the unreliability of being purely like a playing musician, certainly in the kind of fields that I am, which is, I'm kind of, I suppose my field or what I'm known for is alternative style playing, across the genres, be it punk or metal or, occasionally reggae or drum and bass, or they're all kind of, that they're all fields that, the work can sometimes be there, but at the same time, the work can sometimes not be there. This has proved to be the case much more for a musician generally now. But I suppose that, if I go back to when I started it, if you think about it around that time, no punk bands had major deals or anything like that then. Everybody was running independently, so the kind of money the kind of deals that bands started to get in, say, more the mid-90s, they just weren't there in the mid-80s to the mid-90s, and that's when I really kind of, was cutting my teeth with it all, So
yeah, I'm guessing we're the same age. I came up in a scene out in Houston that was like that, where you would get, a GBH that would show up, and there would be like 20 people there, and the only reason those 20 were there was because of word of mouth, or something like that. So
so you just never, you never knew then. And funnily enough, I did a bit of playing for GBH last year. I stood in for them because their drummer Scott had fallen off a ladder at his doing some DIY, nothing to do with playing, but he couldn't play. So I went and I think I did 5 shows with them in Spain. Yeah, it was great because I love GBH. So
they're
mine too,
bands.
from back in the day, especially. So that's how I got into the teaching. Then it was just something that was another way of just keeping myself, round the instrument. It meant my work was drumming, or was teaching drums and mentoring younger or newer people to the instrument, And I've always just kept it going. And at one point, I thought I was going to stop, or I could stop. There's a funny story with this when I was about to join Morissey. And the agent, who was our agent, who kind of put my name forward for the gig, says, I'd sort of said something like, now I've got this, great gig. I don't need to think about teaching. He goes, oh, never give up the teaching. Always keep that going. And I said to him, well, you're doing good. I mean, you don't have to worry about that. Look at you. You're Morrissey's agent. And he goes, yeah, but I'm a bass player.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what?
I mean, everybody's got a side gig,
a
right?
side gig or a side hustle. But they were very prophetic words to me when I heard them. After that, I thought, yeah, if I'm going away playing, I'm going to get somebody that comes in and works for me, and does that, keeps it going, so that when the work eventually ends, and it always does, I've got something to go back to. And that proved to be very useful for me, even with when the pandemic came in. So,
oh yeah, for sure.
I was,
were you doing virtual
I mean,
teachings?
The thing was,
Okay.
when it all changed, which was and how it changed very quickly, because at first, because I have a lot of people that come to me that are locally, everybody was panicking, but I'd already been kind of trying to push the online thing to an extent, because I wanted to attract, people that might want to, work with me or study with me from different parts of the world. But when that happened, I
Yeah,
was suddenly,
yeah,
well, if you can't leave your house, we can still do it. So, although I had like a very small amount of time where it went back to the very basics, I soon picked it up, and I didn't find myself with like a lot of people with no work. In fact, pretty soon into it, I was doing. I was doing great again, with the amount of work I had, albeit all online and from home. But I was very pleased about
right.
that. I'm very thankful as well.
Have you come across recently? Trying to think how to word this. I guess a student that has, in fact, kind of turned things around on you and maybe taught you something or influenced something in your playing, or kind of refreshed something that, that aha moment with a
Well,
student.
yeah, I mean, that can happen a lot, because sometimes you can find a student that, as they're developing, really focuses on an area that you realize you haven't, touched upon for ages, or something, and
Yeah,
you suddenly really, Jesus, they've got a really nifty right hand. I haven't really
yeah,
needed to employ that for a while, and you realize that, there are certain things that, that can end up being overlooked in your playing, and then you've got a student that's really focusing on something, and you realize it. Wow,
yeah.
I better start. I better look at that again.
Have you been working with students that play the styles you play, or have they been all over the
I get,
place?
it's all over really, but yeah, I mean, I do get a certain amount that come to me, or once they've been playing a certain time, want to develop their, what, let's call it high energy drumming. It could be
Okay.
punky, it could be, it could be metally, it could be thrash metal, it could be post punk, it could be pop punk, it could be, up tempo
Yeah.
ska, it could be drum and bass. So I tend to sort of file all of them under the kind of, let's call it high energy drumming, because musically, and musically, stylistically, they're quite different, but fundamentally, there's something behind them that is, that keeps them tangent with each other. And that really, to me, is the high
Yeah.
energy, and the what's behind that, I suppose.
Yeah. What got you into drums? How'd you get your start? Did you have a family member that
Well,
played
I got into
music, or?
music through my dad. He was a guitarist. So I used to go with him around, the pubs and clubs. Not while he was playing, just setting up his equipment or collecting his equipment. And there was always music in the house. So I loved, I was always investigating his record collection, which was fundamentally rock and roll. I guess I'm of that age that, we both are, where our parents, were into, rock and
Yeah.
roll, or well, my father was, and that developed into country for him. And so,
Yeah.
we had a great record collection, I remember, with all the greats that you'd expect from that period. But really, it started for me watching. I'd got into punk. I was about 12. And then I was watching a TV program over in the UK called the Old Grey Whistle Test. I don't know if I've heard of it. Yeah,
Yep.
cool.
Yeah.
And the Damned,
It had some
they
great
did.
acts on
And
there.
this particular night, the Damned were on it. And, I remember the performance was explosive, to say the least. And that was it. That was my defining moment at the end of it. I was watching Rat Scabies, the drummer. And by the end of the show, I mean, he smashed his kit up at the end. They were playing like 2 live songs. It's quite easily found now on YouTube or whatnot. But yeah, they don't even get to the end of the second song, and he's smashing his drums up, and I guess I just found the whole thing super exciting, inspiring.
Yeah.
That was my moment. That was it. That was where I decided I wanted to be a drummer. Took a little while before I managed to convince my parents to get me some kind of kit, but it eventually happened, and that was the beginning of my drumming journey.
What was your
It
first drum set?
was, I don't know if you'd know it so well over there, but Boozy and Hawks. No, they were
Yeah.
actually
Oh my
they were
gosh.
actually more
Yeah.
renowned for making brass instruments, trumpets and the likes. I do believe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where I know him
Well,
from. Yeah.
they got into making kits, and the kit was called Ajax. It was Ajax by Boozy and Hawks. They made kits. I don't know. I was looking at a book I bought recently about the history of the drum kit, and I don't know how long they were making kits. It wasn't an overly long time. I'm sure it wasn't even 30 years, and by the early to mid 70s, they'd stopped. And I'm guessing the kit that I got was probably something that would have been possibly from about the late 60s or something like that. Which kind of
Hmm.
sounds like a relic, and it felt like a relic then, but it was only 1980, so it's probably only 12 or 13 years old. But
Yeah. I mean, we could get into the age thing and what we saw them
yeah.
come and go. So yeah, that's how I know. I used to work at a music shop in Houston. We sold
Mm.
some of their horns and stuff. We carried their horns.
Yeah,
That's where I
yeah.
knew them from. Um, so how did you get into like your first band? Was your first band a punk band
Yeah,
or
no,
was it
no.
something else?
I mean, my first proper band was a punk band. Of course, before that, I did the usual thing of playing on my own, and then you find out somebody in your school plays a guitar, or 2 guys play guitar, and of course, then all the guitarists that I knew, and there wasn't many of them, probably a handful, were all into what we were then calling heavy rock. And so if I wanted to play with other musicians, I had to, I was playing kind of, AC/DC and Black Sabbath tunes and
Yeah.
whatnot. But very soon after, I found a like-minded soul that was much more into the post-punk. And so my very first performance in school, we were playing a song by a band called Magazine. Do you know Magazine? No, I mean,
I
they're
don't.
a pretty influential and prolific post-punk band. They weren't about that long, like a lot of those bands from the time, but they're a great band. They were formed by the original singer of Buzzcocks.
Oh
He left
wow.
Buzzcocks
Okay.
very early
Yeah.
on and formed Magazine. So, and Magazine were there with all the other post-punk bands like Joy Division and Killing Joke and Echo and the Burning Man, U2 even. Uh,
So were
no,
you in
no, I was in
Manchester?
North Wales. So, but that's not a million
Okay.
miles away from Manchester. In fact, Manchester, Liverpool were the closest, biggest cities to where I was living. But there was still a 3-hour
Hmm.
train journey away.
Yeah. So are
I'm
you Welsh
Welsh.
or English?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Whew,
Yes.
that was close. my my
Is
father's from
he?
Northern
Okay.
Ireland,
Yeah.
so yeah, yeah. I got
Oh,
his
right.
mother was
Okay. Yeah. Well, you
Scottish,
understand,
and my
the regions and how passionate
I
people are
do.
about them.
Yep,
Yeah.
I sure do. Um, well, once you got playing, were you regularly getting gigs? What got you into like kind of that next step of maybe playing with somebody, like the Damned or whatever?
Well,
What took
I
you down
had
that
my
road?
first proper band after doing that jamming that I was saying. Eventually, um, there was a band that we formed together in my local town. I come from a town in North Wales called Holyhead, which is to port to Ireland actually.
Yep,
Most people who've caught the boat from mainland UK to Ireland have probably come through Wales, and it's the main port. It's the main port for Dublin, so that's why a lot of people know it.
yep.
Yeah, we had our own little band called Alternative Attack. It was the first band that I released something commercially. There's a single. We did 1 7-inch single that did the rounds. And through that band, it started as a band when I was still in school, but by the end we were starting to, to get gigs further afield and, getting bits and bobs where we were traveling into England. We were playing with other like-minded bands. English Dogs were a band that we played with, yeah. And I ended up
Wow,
playing, yeah,
really?
and Broken Bones because we had that kind of crossovery. By then, we were that kind of crossovery punk hardcore stroke, thrashy metal kind of thing. So,
Yeah. Did you ever get an article in Kerrang about you
no,
guys?
no, we didn't actually. We didn't get that far. The first band that I kind of would have been connected with Kerrang would have been Sacrilege. So yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, but before that, I joined English Dogs, and that was really kind of how I started to, to break ground with kind of, moving forward as a player, getting into
Yeah,
more established bands. So I played with English Dogs only for a very short while, and then they were finishing it. They were splitting up, but Sacrilege were just really starting to take off, and they needed a drummer, so I joined Sacrilege, and that was in.
do you ever cross paths with Nigel Glockler
No, no,
from
because
Saxon?
I mean, again, when we go back to what we were saying earlier, even though with Sacrilege, we had pretty much the best deal a band could have at that time because it was on the same label as the likes of what Metallica were, releasing their music on in Europe. Um, it
Was
was
it
Music
Music
for
for
Nations,
Nations?
but they had a
Okay.
subsidiary called Under One Flag. It was the same label, and GBH were on the punk subsidiary called Rough Justice. So it was all basically,
Yep.
one place. But I
Yeah.
suppose they were trying to, in some way, sort of categorize it slightly. And Music for Nations, I suppose, became the more mainstream. Under One Flag was, like the thrash division, and Rough Justice was the punk
Yeah.
division that had, GBH.
Oh, I had no
Yeah,
idea they
yeah,
were
and
all
the
associated.
Exploited were on it as
That's
well, I think. But even though we were
yeah, yeah,
doing that, it was still very much removed from the likes of bands like Saxon and things because they were the mainstream metal bands of the early '80s that were dealing with much bigger record labels. So those kind of
hmm
bands, Saxon, Iron Maiden, Motorhead, etc., etc. They were bands that were all primarily dealing with major record labels, whereas we were still very much.
yeah,
I mean, okay, we were on Music for Nations, which was by far the biggest, but that was considerably smaller than any, EMI or or Warner Brothers or Sony or whoever.
yeah. When you were starting out and learning drums, did you have a drum
I
instructor
didn't.
yourself?
And it wouldn't be. It would have been something I would have very much gone for had I. But where I lived, it wasn't really, like a town with a. There were plenty of musicians there, but it really was all the musicians were there. Were were unschooled. You know, I mean, my father was self-taught. I knew some good older musicians than me, but they were all self-taught as well. You know, and although they were happy to
Yeah.
pass on tips, nobody would have considered themselves a teacher, and nobody really wanted to teach. You know, I think they were just a bit, you know, I suppose they were a little bit. It didn't cross their mind to see themselves as a teacher. You know, you could ask them, "Oh, how do you do that?" Or then they would tell you, "Well, I just came about this by doing that," or "I practiced this," or "I heard this
Yeah.
record and I got it from that," and that was it. You know, you went home and found the record and tried to do what they'd done. You know,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, that's how I
mm,
learned. I was self-taught. Was a
yeah.
guitar player originally, and stole a pair of drumsticks from the
Oh,
music shop
brilliant.
I used to work at. Took
Yeah,
them home, and
yeah,
learned how to play. Sitting on my bed with a pair of headphones,
yeah,
playing
yeah.
along
That's
with the
great.
album. And then I would do like you did. I would go to, if I knew a
Mm,
drummer or would see someone, I would go over there and introduce
yeah,
myself and then ask them, hey, how did
that's
you
right.
do this beat? How did you do this? And when I get introduced to ghost notes, it was all over
Yeah,
after that. It was like, oh
yeah.
my God.
It can take one little
So
thing that kind of can change so much, can't it? I mean, I struggled very much for the first few years because there was nowhere I could really go, and where I lived, it wasn't exactly prolific for touring the traveling bands to come, by. I'd see the odd gig that were very impactful on me, but generally there wasn't a lot going. But once I was sort of hit that sort of 16 mark, I could start going to bars or was that old, bit older to travel further afield. That's when it really opened up to me because, I could go to local bars or pubs, as we, lovingly refer to them more over here. And if I was, if I could see a drummer, I could get close to them. Maybe sometimes I could even stand by the side.
yeah,
In the break, like you said, you could go over and introduce yourself and say, "Hey, how did you play that bit that I seen in that song that you did? Where you did that peculiar thing?" And then that's when you'd be getting the nuggets, the golden nuggets of information.
right.
And but
Yeah.
sometimes,
Were
sorry, I was just
there,
about to say,
go
just to
ahead. I'm
finish,
sorry.
there were some things now that I teach that I can teach in minutes that I remember struggling with for really years. Simple things, but
Yeah.
independence. I mean, I do this whole thing on my YouTube channel about what's become an iconic rhythm called the D beat, and
Hmm.
the D beat when it's played in its most authentic sense is based on the fact that really it comes from a drummer that at the time doesn't have the independence to be able to keep their right hand playing a quarter note pulse, so that right hand follows the bass drum. I mean, we've all done it, I suppose, a greater or lesser extent in something we played when we're very young to when we're very new to it,
Yeah.
should I say. And that's a perfect example. I played it like that. But I would hear, and I always remember it was the drummer from GBH, actually, Wilf. He could play it what I call correctly. He could play it, with the right hand, keeping the quarter note pulse, the 1, 2, 3, 4, ting, ting, ting,
Yeah.
ting, ting. Well, the bass of the rhythm is dum 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 dum, and that to me at that time was wild independence, because there's no way
Yeah.
I could do it. But when I teach people it, and not necessarily as a D beat, but just as a rock rhythm where it's just a little bit more developed than maybe something that's come before it, you show it to them and you
Yeah.
show it how it's written down and you understand the relation between the bass drum and the hi-hat. It's like the mystery is taken away immediately and they're playing it very quickly. But I can always remember back for me, it was so
Yeah.
frustrating.
Did a lot of those bands that from the new wave of British heavy metal back then, they were playing
Mm,
that. That was a very popular thing. And it was bands like Motorhead that Phil Taylor
yeah,
used to play that stuff. and
Yeah,
it's
very
still
much. I
there.
mean, I've said it because I've done like, I've even interviewed, Tez from Discharge and John Marr from Buzzcocks that I considered, if we draw a line somewhere where, it appears in punk, they're the two guys really. But you're quite right, of course. Phil Animal Taylor was playing it with Motorhead. It appears, in lots of songs before, and there's no question that
Yeah,
Motorhead would have been a massive influence, on the punk and metal drummers, because they were the band that were
yeah,
pushing it with the tempos and the aggression in the music, or the energy, or the growly vocals. And so so that's it. But you're right, that rhythm, it became very impactful, or it's become very impactful from the
yeah.
humble beginnings of where it started.
Right. That's like that guitar riff from 2 Minutes to
Yeah,
Midnight by Maiden. That a
yeah,
lot of bands pick
yeah,
that
yeah,
up. And it just now it's funny because and people are like, man, they ripped that off from
yeah,
Iron Maiden. It's like it's
yeah,
just a riff. What's his name, Dave Smith. He just happened to do it
yeah,
on the
yeah, yeah.
record. You know,
Yes.
So, was there anybody that when you were in the middle of like coming up playing any sort of like a gig, you went to go see a band, you went to go see, no matter who it was, that the light came on and you were like, this is really what I want to
Well,
do?
that had already happened, really, from watching that footage, of the dam. That was this is what I really want to do. Um, I mean, from that, it was just a case of developing, or just trying to do,
Yeah,
like trying to become better, trying to be inspired by what I was seeing. I mean, the very first gig I seen before I was a drummer, I went to watch Buzzcocks play, but and I was 12, but the support band was Joy Division, and yeah, mad,
wow,
yeah. And I didn't even know there was a support band. I'd never been to a concert. I didn't realize you had an opening act. That's how
yeah,
naive I was. But yeah, the great thing about like that period that I remember, and maybe it's just because it's the period I remember, and it's the period I started with. There was a lot of variation in what you file under the word punk, because you had the old
right,
school punk, so you had your bands like your Sex Pistols, the Damned, the Clash, the Stranglers, the Jam, and there's enough variation there. And then of course, from your side of the pond, the Ramones, the Dead Boys, Richard Hell. You got all that going on.
yeah,
That's just from the first, year. And then by the time you're kind of getting into the very late 70s, from over here, for me, just as I'm really getting into music, you've got the post-punk thing, you've got Public Image, you've got Joy Division, as I was saying, Killing Joke, Echo and the Bunnymen, U2 even, drastically different sound, and
right,
playing, drastically different playing style. Very, soon, even around the same time or shortly after, you've got kind of, the next wave of punk coming with Discharge, GBH, The Exploited, and then what was most very influential and explosive to me was the American band, so Dead Kennedys, Black Flag, Bad Brains, one of my all-time favorite bands.
yeah,
All of that was kind of, for me, what was going on in my, like my first 18 months of drumming, So there was an awful lot to draw from. And Devo, I
yeah,
love Devo. You had the kind of, the kind of quirky, more experimental
right,
bands as well. So as a young drummer then, I didn't have to look much further than the things that were in my record collection for diversity, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I was the same way. I started getting
Yeah,
Kerrang magazine and Circus, and just would be enamored with
yeah,
this, reading these magazines, and then I would go, oh, well, I want to hear what you know exploited sounds like. I want to hear what
yeah,
whoever name the Damned,
yeah.
whoever it was, and luckily I lived in a large metropolitan area, so I could go to different record stores. My mom, I used to drive my mom nuts about it. Hey,
Yeah,
can I go to the record store this weekend? Because I was working. I was actually working out of Delhi, so
brilliant.
I was making my own money. I
Yeah,
needed a ride. I was like, hey, can you take me to the
yeah,
record
yeah,
store this weekend? And more times than not, it ended up being my cousin, one of my older cousins, that would take me. But yeah, I mean, it was looking at that stuff and then being able to see it on like the midnight special, or
mm.
Saturday Night Live, or and even the local PBS channel, the public television channel in Houston, used to show
Oh, did
Gray
it?
Whistle
Yeah,
Test. Yeah, they would
yeah,
show them late at night. So I was able to see a
yeah,
lot of those bands, and just like you, just sit there with like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in
yeah,
my life.
yeah.
You
No,
know, and you pick up that sort of stuff playing,
yeah,
because you see them do it. Like, how are they playing? Where are their cymbals placed? Where's the drum set? Where's the toms? How are
yeah,
they right?
exactly
That
that.
sort of
I
thing.
mean, it wasn't too good
Yeah,
over here after that whole, the what I'm talking about, the old grey whistle test. Once it started to become a little bit more underground, um, you wouldn't see a lot of those bands, and even the old grey whistle test kind of changed it, and um, like a lot of bands that I was buying records of or seeing, I wasn't seeing on telly quite the same way. And certainly by the time it became the
yeah,
kind of, the more hardcore influence thing, I mean, I do remember once seeing Dead Kennedys on TV over here, and that blew my mind, but that was about 1983. But generally, you wouldn't see it. You'd have to go to the gigs, but I was still a bit too young to go to the gigs. And like I told you, that period between me starting and me becoming 16, 17 was, it was a tricky. I was getting the records. I was certainly being inspired, but I wasn't able to look, to watch. But of course, that changed once
yeah.
I got a little bit older. I did see Black Flag actually when they first came over in 1981. They were one that did come fairly close to where I lived, so that was.
Was it the original
It wasn't
lineup?
the original line though. The original line got it was, but it's what might be considered the classic lineup that did Damaged album when they were a five piece.
Okay. Yeah,
In
yeah,
fact,
yeah,
Henry Rollins writes about the gig I was at in his book Get in the Van. Because it was quite. I think it was quite memorable for everybody that was there, and not for any sort of
yeah,
anything overly bad reason, but the gig ended because some of the punks had bullet belts, and some of the belt broke, and somebody threw a bullet at the stage, and it hit Greg Ginn, and he collapsed. It hit him in such a way he fainted. Yeah,
really.
and so that was the end of the gig. But I've got some great photos from that. I've got the set list from that gig, and I've shown him to because Ian Mackay was on that tour, and I met him once, and I told him I had it, and I sent them up to him, and he sent them to Henry Rollins, and so
Yeah,
yeah,
that's funny. Yeah, there used to be a place in Houston called the Arts Annex. I don't know if it's still there or not, but we used to get
yeah, did
bands
you?
like Black Flag and Deep
Yeah,
Kennedys and
yeah, yeah,
GBH.
yeah,
That's where GBH played. And it was funny for myself. It was, it went from my family's influences
mm,
of rock,
yeah,
The Doors, bands like
mm,
that, Led Zeppelin, into kind of skipped over and went over into like punk, and then went into the new wave of British heavy metal. And then I rode both sides because I was skating.
yeah,
I had friends in both scenes. So, one night I would be at a punk show. The next night I would be, banging my head,
yeah,
with Motorhead or something, seeing the same people, because like the Skins in Houston, they
yeah.
used to
Right,
go to the
okay,
metal
yeah,
shows, you know? You had
Yeah,
this cross pollination. It was, I mean, I out of all the things that I've done in my life, that is a great memory for me. I
yeah.
love what I went through. I wouldn't have
No,
changed anything.
I mean when you're
You know,
somewhere like that, it was something I was always envious when I was young because, um, I always. I mean, I used to go to Manchester from when I was young, from about 13. Um, but I couldn't stay for the gigs. I mean, the problem was it was 3.5 hours away on the train. I mean, my parents didn't really like me going, and I can understand it. I was a little bit young, but
yeah,
especially as a lot of time I'd go on my own. So, and I'd have to sort of, delegate the chain to the changes, and then I'd be kind of, going around all these shops. But basically, I couldn't go to the shows for, one, because there was no trains late enough back, and secondly because the gigs were over 18s anyway, so you didn't have like sort of all ages shows. Anywhere that were club shows had a
yeah,
bar, that meant they were over 18s. So, and that
yeah,
even if I tried, and I did go to the odd gig like that Black Flag, one of the things, but I wouldn't have. I couldn't do it as like a general thing that, like, say, if I'd lived in Manchester or Liverpool, I'd have probably found a way around it, and I'd have been able to
oh
just
yeah,
catch
yeah,
the last bus home and still been home, at a reasonable time. But if I was going to
yeah,
go to one of those shows, I was going to miss the last train, and so that would have meant that I would have. I wouldn't have got home, so my parents would have reported me as a missing person. It would be too, it was, too problematic. But as I said, that did change. Once I was a little bit older, and especially once I
yeah,
learned to drive, and then I was much more independent in every aspect. I mean, I was able to,
yeah,
go to gigs. I was able to drive myself to gigs as a drummer. That's when things started to move forward for me. Really,
yeah. Has your setup changed? Your drums have you changed them through the years, or they've
Is
been
it
pretty
what is it? What
the
is in
same throughout?
the make or my configuration or both?
Just the
Yeah, the
configuration or both.
configuration, yeah, has changed somewhat throughout the years. I mean, sometimes it's expansive, sometimes it's not. It really depends on like what I'm doing. I mean, I did a little bit of work and have been up until recently for a death metal band, and when I started that, I decided, yeah, when I
Wow.
decided to do that, I decided to be indulgent, and I expanded the kit considerably. I mean, fundamentally, I suppose I use generally a 4 or 5 piece kit, and work from that. But once I sort of, was doing that, I thought, right, okay, I'm actually going to, I've used a double pedal for 35 plus years, but I decided no, I'm going to go for the double bass, and I added sort of 2 concert toms. I had 3 rack toms, a floor tom, um, 2 sets of hi hats, 2 chinas. So I just expanded on what a setup may be. But when I'm playing with, say, Sham 69, currently that's a 4 piece kit. It's back to a standard 4 piece kit. The only thing I allow myself
Yeah.
to be indulgent is I have a China symbol.
Well, I mean that's overstepping the
Yeah.
bounds, Spike. So you know, going
Yeah.
too far,
Well,
man.
sometimes you can play with people they don't. I remember taking the China symbol when I was playing for the Damned, and it got commented on. Yeah.
Really,
I think Captain Sensible
that's
says
funny.
something like, I don't remember seeing one of them in the drums, on the typical drum set in '77. So I
Wow,
kind of, but I've
that's
seen I've
funny.
seen people in the dam using them since. Of course, it was just probably just a
Yeah,
sort of little comment, just to acknowledge or to make a point that he
yeah,
could, had clocked that I was bringing something a little different in.
yeah. With you adding the extra bass drum, was it a period of adjustment compared to using a
Yeah,
double pedal?
I'm gonna. Yeah, it, it it was. I mean, I did it for a few reasons at the time. One was because a lot of the kits that I was using when we were, like because we were doing a lot of fly-ins to gigs, and so the kit would be there'd be kits that are set up like or supplied for you. And sort of a
Right.
lot of them
Yeah.
were semi-built, and I found it to be more problematic trying to get rid of the bass drum just to set up my double pedal. Um, so, and also I wanted to kind of I felt as if we're playing kind of that music. I wanted to kind of develop the feel and have a bit of experience of working with a double bass drum, which is quite a different animal
Yeah.
to a double pedal. I mean, it's a lot wilder. It's I can see why you get like a lot of drummers that still go for the aesthetic of the double bass drums for the look, but set up a double pedal to play essentially on one
Yeah.
single.
Yeah.
Because the first thing is when you've got the sound coming at you from two places, and two big bass drums, it can be somewhat a bit it can throw you a bit, and
Yeah.
it's great for the kind of let's for like your kind of obviously Motorhead would be the perfect example, through to even kind of your Metallica and Slayer. But once you start getting into kind of quite intricate, tricky, um, double bass or double pedal patterns, it can be a bit disorientating because the sound is coming from two
Yeah.
areas. It doesn't matter how much you try and dial the bass drums into, to sound the same, they don't. Just the fact that the air is
Yeah.
coming, it's being moved in different directions, and so it's great for the powerful, relentless, but as soon as
Yeah.
you start to to move away from that and start to play kind of just more maybe unusual patterns. As I said, it can be a bit disorientating.
Are you using
I have
triggers
been,
with those
yeah, I was using
both those things?
triggers with it, so and the triggers helped with that, of course, because it's one consistent sound. And I with the triggers and the double bass drums, I think I like that a lot, almost more than the double pedal we won, because it's not so prone to mistriggering, you know.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, I used to use kind of like the double pedal when I've been playing fast hardcore, and I think I prefer that. Like the single bass drum and the double pedal. I think it works better.
Yeah.
So it's really it's all dependent on what you're doing, really. A big part why I ended up using the triggers while I was playing that stuff. I mean, that's finished for me now. But when I was doing it up until recently, was I just had a bit more control over it, um, for the sound and also for the monitoring, because I found that again we're just kind of flying in and using different kits and different, like just basically different stage crew. Sometimes when I was trying to get the monitoring back of the bass drums in my in ears, because you've got the two bass drums and two bass drum mics, I'd be getting, way too much spill from the bottom of the snare, which is a very
Oh yeah.
unpleasant
Yeah.
sound. It's not like when you ask, "Oh, can you put a
Yeah.
bit of snare in my in ears?" It's the bottom, and you can't control it. So that's another
Yeah.
side to it, that the beast of the double bass drums. Where of course when you have your trigger, you just ask him, right? Can I just have that sound? It doesn't, because I don't really like the rest of the kit in my in ears. I just tend to find that you ended up getting bludgeoned with volume in the end. It's like, oh, turn that up a bit. Oh, turn that up a bit. Oh, now I can't hear.
Do you play with a click track, or
I've
have you
played
ever
with a
played with a
click
click
track,
track?
yeah, many times, but and certainly in the studio for the most part, I always do, but not live. Not with the the bands and the music I do. It's not really something that's proved to be necessary up to now. I mean, sometimes say like
Right.
when I was playing with
Yes.
Morrissey, we'd have certain songs that would have some kind of backing track going on. So of course, for that track there would be a click, but it wouldn't be like something that was for the whole set. It would just be for certain songs
Yeah.
that might have some kind of sequencer part going, or an orchestrated part or something.
Yeah. What are there any drummers that you look at today that really amaze you? Anyone aside from the usual suspects? Is there anyone that you're really
Well,
impressed
I
with?
mean, I'm always, there's always somebody sort of, making an impression on me somewhere. I mean, like I've been looking at Eloy with um, Slipknot. He blows me away.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, the past number of years from doing so much of the metal stuff, it's a new kind of area for me. Well, it's a new and old area. It's an area I've kind of come into, and I'm just seeing these guys or girls as well that are just amazing players. Just brilliant technique, and you know, all the chops and everything, and the commitment to the music they play. Um, but
I don't understand how Eloy plays so hard, but yet you
I
rarely hear
know,
him make a
yeah,
mistake.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, he just some of the stuff that he's done, the videos I've seen of him playing, I don't understand how he plays so hard. And you
no,
never hear him like hit
no,
a
no.
rim or anything
No,
on his fills. I mean, he
I
is
know, and
on
that
top
that's
of it.
kind of why I'm so impressed. In fact, I was watching something by him last night. Like a drum kit breakdown, and then it showed a bit of him playing. Um, but yeah, so there's players all the time. I mean, yeah, it's just like that. I'll see something. I'll always check the drummers out, and I don't necessarily kind of go for names, but I check out all the names, of course. Um, I
Yeah.
mean, Brooks Wackerman, I enjoy watching. I mean, I remember him with Bad Religion, and he was. I'm gonna have to just move this because I need to plug in. I watched him with Bad Religion and was a big fan of his playing. But when I heard him with Avenged Sevenfold, it was another thing again.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Um, you put up a video of you playing like sitting on the side of the
Oh yeah.
stage with your pad and you're warming up. How did
Well,
that
that was
come
the only
along?
the weekend before last, and I was playing with Sham 69 in France, and Fishbone were on the bill, and they were actually on just before us. So, I've been a big fan of Fishbone since I first heard them in '88. They've been going, I suppose, for a while before that, but they kind of made inroads in the UK around 88, 89 was where they really
Yeah.
started happening for them. And I've been a big fan. I loved all those kind of bands that were, because I was a big fan of Bad Brains for many years before that. When Living Colour, Fishbone, Chili Peppers, Faith No
Yeah.
More, all those bands. I loved them just because of how they were drawing on the different influences. So, but yeah, coming back to it, so Fishbone were one of them. And then they were on the bill just before us. So I was like, well, I'm not going to miss them. Normally, as much as I do try and watch a band that's playing before I play, often it's not the best time for me. I can't focus. I feel as if, it's just one of those, the job in hand, so to speak. So I'm
Right.
better to kind of just, to just find myself my space, get my pad out, start warming up, just getting into the sort of vibe, ready to play. Um, And then
Yeah.
normally I'll try and go and watch a bit of the band. I want to watch them, but it's just my mind is elsewhere. But so with this one, I thought, well, I've got to do that. But I thought, and then the way they set up, because the drummer was set essentially, set up side of the stage and not in the traditional spot. So it meant that I was behind him in the wings, if you like, I would, not, I
Yeah.
wasn't sort of behind him if he would have been set up in your typical back of the stage facing forward. So I seen the kit was there. I thought, right, I'll just go in the wings with my pad and, you know, and
Yeah.
play, kind of not play along, but lock into their tempos and rhythms. I've done it a little bit
Yeah.
before over about the past year or so. If it's a band I like when I'm playing festivals or something, rather than sitting in some dank room somewhere warming up, which I'm all actually always happy to do. I just sort of think, right, I'll go to the side of the stage, and they start playing their tune, and I just lock into the tempo, and then of course you could practice stuff off
Yeah.
that, can't you? You can start, maybe the sort of tempo lends itself that you can start, practicing a few rudiments or whatever along, or you move off the sort of tempo of the song and just practice what you feel you need to. Or if I was doing a lot of the double bass drum stuff, I'd be, just trying to sort of keep that, my feet, working the tempo that the band's playing on the stage, and it was just a little bit more of a, as I said on the post, mixing business with pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was really funny. It
Yeah,
was great to
yeah, yeah. It was
see that
just,
happening.
it was just one of those little things that's what it is, because I was enjoying watching Fishbone, but I wasn't feeling guilty that, I should be kind of getting ready and getting warmed up. I was doing that, so I was happy.
Yeah. 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 It was,
Mhm.
I loved it. I thought it was really funny to see you do it. All right.
Okay.
Final question. We're running on an hour. I don't want to keep you much longer. Heel up or heel down?
ah, well, for me, that is very, very dependent on what I'm playing. I mean, when I
Okay.
started playing, I was heel down for a long time. In fact, I remember when I got my first double pedal, it was one of those things that was awkward for me, because there was no way I could use my play heel down with my left leg, my left foot. Um, and so I remember I'd been playing to that point where I must have been playing heel down, just because I remember that being a sort of bit of a conundrum. But I decided at some point, probably round that, to start playing heel up, just because also, I was seeing, I wanted more power out the bass drum. So, and I guess, the obvious way of doing that was to play, with heel up. And that worked as well for, like the
Yeah.
double pedal, double kick style thing. But when I started to look into jazz playing, and I'm, big on my jazz playing. I mean, not to the sense to be a professional jazz musician, but to try and implement
Yeah.
a lot of the
Sure.
skills that are required to play jazz, and apply it to my own playing. Just for, it could be for something like a dynamic range. It could be for, to have a nifty
Hmm.
right hand, because you do need that with the kind of, lot of the stuff I play in jazz. It's a good way of working that with all the independence that's required for jazz. One thing I have noticed that is much better for jazz is to play with your feet, heel down. And I went to a good, because I have had the occasional lesson, over the past, the 20 or 30 years, where if somebody I really like and they teach, I'll go and, and see them. And there's a drummer I like, and I went to have a look at, specifically my jazz. And the one thing I said to him was, I don't really know how to approach, how to play the bass drum. And he got me to play a song, a Buddy Rich song that I knew. And there was a part in it, where it has, what they call the feathering bass drum, But
Yeah.
I said, well, I'm playing it like this. And he says, well, you play it and I'll kind of keep giving you the hand signal down until it's right. What he meant was he was kind of pointing downwards as if to say, play quieter. And I was playing it and I could see him going
Yeah.
down and down and down until in the end, in comparison to what I started it at, it was like the difference being between 10 and 1.5, And so we
Right.
spoke about that. I mean, it probably wasn't that drastic, but it felt it. But we were speaking about it, and we was, speaking about like he'd watched a lot of the great jazz drummers playing in London. Again, he was there. He'd seen Buddy Rich, Louis Bellson, etc., etc.
Who was
His
this
name's
guy?
Steve White. He played with
Okay.
Paul Weller. That's what he's well known for. But he's a
Oh,
great,
okay.
he's a really. I first heard him on an album that was a jazz album, and he was about 17. Like a live jazz album, and his playing was great on that. So that was one of the reasons why I went to him. I'd got to know him as a professional, but I went to him because I knew
Yeah.
he kind of had a great understanding of that kind of playing. But we were talking about it, and he was saying about like the drummers playing heel down, and that's kind of where a better way to just to get the natural balance for that. So that's a long-winded answer, but basically, I suppose what I'm
That's
saying
okay.
is that you play according to you're a how you play the bass drum should be determined by musically what you're doing or the velocity you want out of
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah. To adapt to each
definitely, yeah.
situation.
So I think that's yeah. As the player for what I do or what I'm known for or the work I undertake, it's heel up, but I still, funnily enough, even when I was having a little razzle on the kit today, in between some kids coming for their lessons, because I was conscientious, there was a class next door, and they were listening to some classical music. I thought, well, I don't want to be thrashing around the kit, so I was just working on some few little jazz
Yeah.
lick exercises that I got, and I was very conscious about, the playing the heel down. So it is something that I try to be mindful of that does get practiced with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Spike, thank you for coming on. I
Well, thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
I've
It's been
enjoyed
fun.
it.
Yeah, we'll have to get you back
Anytime.
sometime. Yeah. Yeah, where just tell us real quick, where can we
Well,
find
you
you
can find me
online?
easily. I mean, my website is just Spike. I've got two websites actually. I've got spiketsmith.com. That's kind of my main website that offers all my services, be it if you wanted me for live work or studio work, or you want me, I do online recording sessions for my own little studio. Even you can get in touch with me for lessons. But I've also got SpikeTSmithDrums.com. That's much more focused on my